Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. And you're right, Anthony. I did forget just how good that defense was for Alabama in 2020. Definitely kind of the separating factor between them and this Ohio State team, although that Ohio State defense was very good as well. So, would be a very, very fun game. I think would fit a lot of different molds. It could be an absolute shootout between those offenses, could be a slugfest between those defenses, but I think the 2019 LSU team, that's going to give you points. The 2022 Georgia team, that's going to give you something like 14-10. And then Alabama will be somewhere in the middle if I had to imagine. But let's get to some postseason questions. There's some big time things to talk about as we come out of this year, and one of the bigger ones is just how much did this season matter? How much did the regular season in particular matter as we moved into the CFP? And there's a good argument both ways as far as I'm concerned. And I think when you look at the CFP, you had two teams face off that wouldn't have been in the 4 team, wouldn't have been in the BCS for sure, and would have been in the position where you lost games, and it wouldn't have been anyone's fault but their own. They would have Notre Dame would have lost that NIU game. Michigan would have beaten Ohio State, and you look forward and say those teams probably don't deserve a chance to play for a national title. Obviously, they got that chance this year, and that's kind of the big time argument. You had two games that hypothetically should mean a ton, especially that Michigan loss to Ohio State should mean a lot. It didn't necessarily mean too much. Now, what I will push back on is that game didn't matter at all, because I would make a very good argument that if Ohio State did not lose that Michigan game, they probably don't win a national title, because I think certain things happened in that locker room that had to happen over the last month that probably wouldn't have happened if they had beaten Michigan by 7 points, by 3 points. So it is going to be a really interesting thing to watch. There is no doubt about that. But overall, I think when you look at this regular season, yes, there were certain games that were less important, quote unquote. The NIU game was, quote unquote, less important. So was the Michigan game at the end of the year. But you look over at the Big 12, there were tons of games that were important. There were tons of fan bases that were very much engaged in what the season was, as the season was going on, that wouldn't have been engaged halfway through October, especially into November. There was going to be a lot of people that checked out because their team didn't have a chance in the CFP. Now, I don't necessarily totally identify with that. I think the reality is you give these games what the importance that or the games have the importance that you give them. So I think we put more emphasis on the regular season. The players will, and they will have more energy in these games, and they'll mean more hypothetically. Maybe they won't mean more in terms of a CFP. They obviously do mean something. You saw the reaction from Notre Dame after they lost that game. You saw the reaction from Ohio State after they lost that game. These games really do mean something. Obviously, they're not necessarily the disqualifying factor that they used to be in. We can have an argument, whether they should or shouldn't, because I think there's a good argument both ways on that as well. But overall, it matters to these guys. So the regular season, as much as it, mattered or didn't matter as you talk about the CFP, it mattered to these guys. And I think that's the most important thing, and that's the thing that we have to highlight just a little bit more often in this sport, is not the CFP tie-in. It's not the, way that this game totally changes the way the CFP plays out, just the way that this changes the way this season plays out for these kids, and the way that these kids really care about every last game that they play. So I fully understand this conversation. I totally get that in some ways it meant more, in some ways it meant less, but I do think there's moments in this regular season where you look back and you say, there was a lot of great out of that thing. And overall, the regular season, whether it meant more or less for the CFP, I think it meant plenty throughout this year. So there's a great argument there. Definitely going to be an interesting thing to watch. And yeah, so Anthony, there's a lot of different changes that are being discussed, and the conference champion getting into the Final Four, getting into the quarterfinals has been a big part of that conversation. I don't think it's going to change next year. I do think there will be a little bit more conversation around some of those teams, especially the at-large teams from the ACC or the Big 12 as we move forward. But overall, I don't see the conference champion thing changing all that soon. It could change in the next couple of years. Maybe in 2026 they have enough on the table for those teams to say that's more than fine, but it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. There's no doubt about that. They're going to want to keep that auto bid at the very least. The auto buy is a little bit more of a precarious situation. Was the national title too late this year? This is a very real conversation, and one that was had by a lot of people leading up to this game that just didn't feel like a national title day. And I kind of felt that as well. There wasn't this massive energy around the college football season. We were coming off a remarkable divisional round from the NFL that got a lot of attention throughout the weekend, and we got into Monday, and a lot of people kind of remembered that there was a national title that day. So it's one of those things that I'll get into kind of early next week, talk about some of the different solutions for this, how they could kind of change the calendar to kind of make this a little bit better. I do think you do have to push it up, so I do think you have to figure out, maybe moving the season up 1 week, maybe playing CFP games on that Army-Navy weekend. I don't love that, I'll be totally honest with you, but I understand where they're coming from, and as long as Army-Navy have that standalone game, I wouldn't necessarily be overly upset, but it is something that I do think needs to happen. I think you're a little bit too deep into 2025 as you play that national title now. Those players don't necessarily care, there's no doubt about that, but it's going to be a little bit of a tightrope walk to see how you kind of move this thing up without crunching everything down and giving these guys no bye weeks, but you got to find a way to move it up just a little bit. If I had to imagine, at least before that divisional round for the NFL, because that takes up a lot of oxygen in the room. Then we got Ohio State. Did they get here in spite of or because of the Michigan loss? And I'd argue it's because of. I think that Michigan game played a huge role in what this Ohio State team was down the stretch, more from a mentality perspective than anything else. Losing to Michigan for this senior class that in large part came back to beat that team. You know, they came back obviously to win a national title, and they were able to do that. But all those seniors are now leaving this program with no wins over that team, and that made them very mad. There's no doubt about that. If Ohio State beats Michigan, let's say Jack Sawyer takes that pick back to the house, they win 17-13. Do they make the adjustments? Are they as aggressive of a team when they play Tennessee or when they play Oregon or when they play Texas or Penn State or Notre Dame? But also, are they even in the position to play those teams? If they beat Michigan, they're going to the Big Ten Championship playing Oregon, and then they could be in the Penn State spot, they could be in the Texas spot, they could be the number one seed overall. So you would have been in a position where maybe the energy about this team wouldn't have been quite right. Maybe the intensity of this team wouldn't have been quite right if the terrible thing didn't happen. As crazy as that sounds, you know, the Michigan loss is obviously something you never want to take and obviously something that they'd love to give back right about now, but the reality is, I do think it flipped a switch in a lot of these players' minds where they said, we're not being denied anymore. I do think that totally changed what this team was, and I think they won the national title in a large part because of that Michigan loss and the way that it changed these players. Was this the toughest run in college football history? And I think the answer is yes here. Now, the question is more, is it tougher or is it just longer than some of the other ones out there? So you have Tennessee, Oregon, Texas, Notre Dame. Beating those four teams in a row is as impressive as just about anything I've seen in college football. There's no doubt about that. But if you put LSU in front of that CFP path, do they roll through them? If you put Bama in front of that CFP path, do they roll through them? So, while Ohio State did an incredible job throughout this tournament run, and I will say the number 9 team, number 3, 4, and then number 2 team in the country on their way to a title is incredibly tough. There's no doubt about that, but I do think there is a question of if it happens next year, let's say Texas is in this position and they are the 8 seed and they go on a run to win the national title. Is that now the best run in college football history? And then the year after that, and then the year after that. So that's kind of the big worry for me, and that's the thing that is giving me a little bit of pause with this 12-team playoff is all the runs are going to be tough because that's the reality of the 12-team playoff. Where does Ryan Day rank in college football head coaches? We talked about this a little bit in the last segment, so I won't spend too much time here, but 7-10 in his career, national title winner, and is only 45 years old, as crazy as that sounds. In my mind, he's the second best head coach in this game. I think, frankly, I probably would have put him top 3, top 4 right before the CFP. He is obviously elevated over the last couple of games. I think I would argue Kirby Smart is still number 1 in the game. Those back-to-back championships are a huge thing for him and obviously is still at the very top of his game. If you want to put Dabo Swinney above him, I wouldn't necessarily go against you too much on that one, but I do think, as a lot of people think that Dabo Swinney might not quite be the top of his game as he was back in the day, but overall, fantastic head coach. There's no doubt about that. He is a top 5 head coach before this run. To me, he is a very, very solidly a top 2 head coach after it. Now, you could make the argument that he should be 3, that he should be 4. I don't know if you can make the argument they should be anything lower than 5, if I'm being totally honest. Remarkable head coach and obviously at the top of the mountaintop right now. And then we got to ask, is the Big Ten's run going to continue into 2025? And this is something we'll get into in a little bit in more detail tomorrow. But 2025, you look forward in, you got a lot of really good teams. Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State, all setting up for huge years. You have Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, a couple of these other teams that really look like they're setting up for fantastic years as well. So it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. You look at the formula that Michigan had in 2023 that Ohio State had this year. Penn State kind of has that in 2025. Now, I don't know if they're quite the teams that those teams were, at least from a talent level, but they're definitely up there. And they're definitely a team that could make that type of run and give the Big Ten 3 consecutive national championships for the first time since 1940 to 1942. So the SEC has a ton of big-time teams. And maybe the best team in the country going into next year with Texas. But overall, the Big Ten has a ton of teams up at that top end. I think they will be the best conference in 2025, at least going into it. I don't think the gap is massive by any years, kind of the same way with this year where the SEC might be a little bit, I don't want to say deeper, but might have a little bit more teams that can compete for a CFP spot, but the Big Ten might have more teams that can compete for a national title spot. So the Big Ten is going to be awesome. They have 3 teams in my top 5 that we'll go through here in a second going into next year, but the SEC is going to do everything they can to bounce back next year to knock them off that pedestal. They have all the ability in the world to do that. There's no doubt about that, but the Big Ten's run, as far as I see it, is going to carry over at least a little bit into 2025. Will it go throughout the entire year? Is a conversation that can be had, and definitely will be an interesting thing to watch unfold, especially over the offseason as some of these younger quarterbacks in the Big Ten, how do they fare early on, and will definitely inform what we think about them going into the 2025 season. But let's get into that a little bit. My way too early top 10 for the 2025 season, very tough to put together. A lot of teams are right around that 7 to 12 mark or 7 to 13 mark. I feel pretty good about the group that I have right about now, so we'll talk about it right after this, so stick with us.